The morning began quietly in the small city of Briar Glen, where the oldest diner in town had poured coffee for generations of local families. No one watching the peaceful street could have imagined that, before the morning was over, one officer's arrogance would begin unraveling a web of corruption buried inside the police department for years. A black couple sat quietly in a corner booth, plainly dressed, speaking in low voices and disturbing no one. Then an officer entered with his chest pushed forward, searching for someone he believed would be easy to humiliate. Customers watched the scene unfold, yet almost no one found the courage to speak. What the officer never understood was that the two people he had chosen to target were far from ordinary citizens. They were undercover detectives deep inside an investigation that could end his career, his sergeant's career, and expose a truth the whole department had been burying for a long time. Autumn had settled over Briar Glen in a soft golden light, the kind that made even tired eyes feel a little more forgiving. Darius Hale and his wife Celeste had just finished an overnight surveillance shift. It was the kind of work that drained the body but never dulled the mind, because both of them had trained themselves for decades to stay sharp no matter how long the night stretched. They turned into the gravel lot of Marlowe's Diner in an aging gray sedan with a dented rear bumper, the kind of car no one noticed twice. Darius wore a faded denim jacket over a plain gray shirt, and Celeste had on a simple cardigan, her hair tied back loosely. Nothing about either of them suggesting anything but two ordinary people looking for breakfast after a long night. Inside, the diner smelled like fresh coffee and bacon on the griddle, the hum of quiet conversation filling the room. They chose a booth near the window, the same one they always chose because from that seat, Darius could see the entire room and the street outside without turning his head. Celeste slid in across from him and immediately reached for the menu, though she already knew what she wanted, because ordering the same thing every time was one more habit that made them forgettable. A young waitress took their order with a tired smile. 2 coffees, 2 plates of eggs, toast on the side. Nothing unusual about any of it. They talked quietly while they waited. It was the kind of conversation only 2 people who trusted each other completely could share. Celeste teased him about the way he always drank his coffee too fast and burned his tongue every single time. Darius laughed and admitted, as he always did, that she was right. The ease between them came from more than marriage alone. It came from years of watching each other's backs in rooms far more dangerous than a diner booth. Neither of them spoke about work. They never did in public, not even here, not even after a grueling overnight shift. Celeste reached across the table and took his hand for a moment, her thumb brushing over his knuckles, a small gesture that said more than words ever could. Darius looked at her the way he always did, like she was still the same woman he had fallen in love with at the academy so many years ago, back when neither of them had any idea how far they would eventually go together. The waitress returned with their plates, and for a while there was only the comfortable silence of 2 people enjoying a meal after a long, difficult night. Celeste mentioned almost offhandedly that the diner reminded her of a small place in her hometown, one her grandmother used to take her to when life felt slower and simpler. Darius listened the way he always did, fully present, never rushing her, allowing the memory to unfold at its own pace across the quiet table. He told her in return about the first apartment they had shared together, a cramped little unit above a laundromat, where the walls shook every time the dryers ran, and how neither of them had cared one bit because they were finally together after years of being stationed in different cities. They laughed softly at the memory, the kind of laughter that only exists between 2 people who have built an entire life out of small, ordinary moments like this one. For a little while, they were not detectives or partners assigned to a dangerous case. They were simply a husband and wife enjoying breakfast on a quiet autumn morning, just like any other couple in the diner. Outside, sunlight caught the chrome of a squad car pulling into the lot, tires crunching slowly over the gravel. Neither Darius nor Celeste reacted, because squad cars stopping at diners were nothing unusual in a town like Briar Glen. What neither of them expected was the way that particular morning was about to change everything, not just for themselves, but for an entire department built on secrets. The front door suddenly swung open harder than necessary, and Officer Grant Sutter stepped inside as though he owned the building and everyone in it. He was broad-shouldered, built like someone who spent more time in the gym than on actual patrol. His uniform pressed sharp, his sunglasses pushed up on his head, even though the diner was dim. The first thing he did was bark at the young hostess to move a family out of a booth so he could sit closer to the window. She scrambled to obey without a single word of protest. Grant carried himself in a way that made people instinctively shrink in their seats, not because he had done anything to them personally, but because his presence carried the weight of a badge he clearly believed made him untouchable. His eyes traveled slowly across the diner, searching the room with the cold attention of a predator looking for the weakest target. When his gaze landed on Darius and Celeste, sitting quietly in their corner booth, something in his expression shifted, something small and ugly that most people in the room did not even notice. He had grown up in this town, the son of a mechanic and a school secretary, and somewhere along the way, wearing the uniform had convinced him that respect was something owed to him automatically rather than something earned through decency. Colleagues at the station often described him as ambitious, though few ever used that word with any warmth behind it. He had been passed over for a promotion repeatedly in recent years, a fact that troubled him more than he ever admitted aloud. And lately he had taken to asserting his authority in small, petty ways whenever the opportunity presented itself. This particular morning, tired and irritable after a rough overnight shift of his own, he was looking for exactly that kind of opportunity, and the quiet couple in the corner booth seemed, to his narrow way of thinking, like an easy target. He noted the faded jacket and the cardigan with a small loose thread near the collar. He noted the old car parked outside that did not match in his mind the kind of car regular customers of this diner usually drove. None of those details meant anything, and none of them were his concern. But Grant had built his career around deciding who belonged and who did not after little more than a glance. He walked over slowly, thumbs hooked into his belt, his boots heavy against the tile floor, every step deliberate and loud enough to draw attention. "I don't recognize you two," he said, stopping beside their table, his voice pitched just loud enough for nearby booths to hear. Celeste looked up first, calm, polite, the same expression she might give a stranger asking for directions. "We're just having breakfast, officer," she said simply. There was no edge in her voice. Darius said nothing yet, choosing instead to study the man in front of him, the way he studied every subject in every interview room he had ever worked. Patient, quiet, absorbing every detail. Grant asked for identification, though he had no legal reason to. And Celeste, still calm, asked what exactly they had done wrong. He didn't answer the question directly. Instead, he repeated himself louder this time, insisting he needed to see identification because, in his words, people like you don't usually eat here. A few nearby customers glanced up from their plates, uneasy, sensing the shift in the air, but unwilling to get involved. Darius finally spoke, his voice low and almost gentle. "We haven't broken any laws, and we'd like to finish our breakfast." Grant's jaw tightened at the calm in Darius's voice, as if the absence of fear offended him personally. "I didn't ask for your opinion," Grant said, leaning down slightly. His hand rested on the edge of the table, close enough that Celeste could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "I asked for identification, and I'm not going to ask a third time." Celeste tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable, and asked quite reasonably whether he had any actual cause to demand it from two people simply eating breakfast. Grant straightened, clearly irritated that neither of them had shown the fear he expected, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the small crowd now watching from nearby booths. "Cause is whatever I decide it is," he said loudly enough for the whole room to hear, a statement that drew a visible wince from an elderly woman seated nearby. "Stand up," Grant said, his tone hardening into a command. "Both of you, get up and leave." The diner grew quiet. Forks stopped halfway to mouths, and phones slowly rose as customers sensed that something deeply wrong was about to happen. Grant's patience, thin from the start, evaporated entirely within seconds, and his voice climbed another notch louder, echoing now off the tiled walls of the diner. He reached out and gripped Darius's shoulder, not gently, pressing down as though trying to force him upward out of the booth by sheer will alone. "I said get up," he snapped, "before I make this much worse for both of you." Darius did not flinch, did not raise his voice, simply looked down at the hand on his shoulder, and then back up at Grant with an expression that unsettled the officer more than any shout could have. Around the room, a few customers had begun quietly filming with their phones, the way people do now when they sense injustice happening, but feel too afraid to physically intervene. An older man near the counter chuckled under his breath, muttering something about finally someone doing their job, while a young mother, 2 booths down, looked horrified, pulling her own phone from her purse with trembling hands. Most of the diner remained silent, gaze moving between unfinished plates and the unfolding scene. No one quite brave enough to stand and speak. A retired construction worker near the front window set down his fork entirely, his jaw tightening as he watched, though even he did not rise from his seat. 2 teenagers sharing a plate of pancakes by the counter exchanged a nervous glance, one of them lifting a phone just high enough to record without drawing attention, careful to keep it low against the table's edge. Behind the counter, a young line cook peered through the small serving window, his spatula frozen mid-motion, watching the confrontation with wide, uncertain eyes. The tension in the room had grown thick enough that even the clinking of silverware seemed to have gone quiet, replaced by the low murmur of Grant's voice growing louder with every passing second. "You two don't look like you can even afford what's on this table," Grant said, his voice dripping with cruelty. Even his partner outside looked uncomfortable through the window. Maybe that's the real problem. Maybe you're here to cause trouble, or maybe you simply can't pay. Either way, I'm not interested in finding out the hard way. Celeste's expression did not change, though her eyes had sharpened, taking in every word, every gesture, filing it away with the precision of someone who had spent years learning to read exactly this kind of man. Evelyn Marlowe, the diner's owner for many years, came rushing out from behind the counter, her apron still dusted with flour, her voice pleading for calm. "Officer, please, these are paying customers." "There's no need for this," she said, stepping close enough to place herself almost between Grant and the booth. Grant waved her off without even looking at her, telling her to get back behind the counter and let him handle his job. And Evelyn's face fell, caught between fear of the officer and shame for the couple she had just watched be treated so unfairly. At that moment, Sergeant Wade Carver entered, drawn by the commotion visible through the diner's front window. Wade was broad-shouldered, with gray at his temples that made people assume wisdom where there was often only stubbornness. Instead of calming the scene as Evelyn had hoped, Wade immediately sided with his junior officer, placing a firm hand on Grant's shoulder in support rather than restraint. "What's the trouble here?" Wade asked, though his tone made clear he had already chosen a side before hearing a single detail. Grant explained, twisting the story slightly, painting Darius and Celeste as suspicious, uncooperative, possibly dangerous, though nothing about their behavior had suggested any of that at all. Wade nodded along, glancing at the couple with open suspicion, the kind of look that assumed guilt before a single fact had been established. The tension in the diner thickened, customers now openly staring, phones raised a little higher, the sound of Wade's radio crackling faintly at his hip. Celeste remained still, her hands folded calmly on the table, watching both officers with the patience of someone who had faced far worse men in far more dangerous rooms. Darius finally spoke again, his voice steady, almost too calm for the situation, cutting through the noise like a blade through paper. "Is this your final decision?" he asked, looking directly at Wade, not a trace of fear in his voice. The question hung in the air, simple, precise, and sharp enough to make even Wade hesitate before answering. By now, nearly every customer in the diner had shifted their attention entirely toward the corner booth, sensing that something about this moment did not fit the ordinary shape of a diner disturbance. A retired schoolteacher sitting near the register leaned toward her husband and whispered that something about the couple felt strange, though she could not quite explain what. Evelyn, still standing nearby with her hands twisted into her apron, noticed it too. The way the couple's eyes moved, tracking every officer, every exit, every face in the room with the precision that had nothing to do with fear. Celeste's gaze flicked briefly toward Darius. A small, almost invisible signal passed between them. It was the kind of silent communication that only years of partnership could build. Darius's eyes, meanwhile, moved with quiet efficiency. First to the patrol car parked outside, memorizing its plate number without even seeming to look directly at it. He noted the names stitched onto Grant's uniform and Wade's, filing both away with the same effortless precision he might use cataloging evidence at a crime scene. He glanced toward the small security camera mounted above the diner's counter, confirming it was active, its red light blinking steadily. None of this behavior matched that of an ordinary, frightened citizen being harassed by police. An ordinary person faced with two armed officers demanding they leave might tremble, might raise their voice, might beg or argue or cry. Darius and Celeste did none of these things. Instead, they observed, cataloged, and waited. Their stillness was unnerving in a way neither Grant nor Wade seemed capable of understanding. Celeste noted the way Wade's radio crackled with a dispatch call he chose to ignore, carefully preserving the sequence of events for later reference. She counted the exits without moving her head, noting the back door beside the kitchen and the front entrance both officers now stood between. Darius, meanwhile, kept his breathing slow and even, a technique he had taught rookies during training sessions years earlier, the kind of discipline that kept a clear head no matter how loud the room around him became. Neither of them exchanged more than a glance, yet somehow, in that glance, an entire plan passed silently between them, refined by years of working dangerous rooms together without ever needing to speak a single word aloud. Grant, misreading their calm entirely, assumed it was fear disguised as defiance, the kind of frozen silence he had seen plenty of times from people too intimidated to fight back. Emboldened by what he believed was total control of the situation, he pressed harder, stepping closer, his hand drifting toward the radio at his belt, as if preparing to call for backup against two unarmed diners. "You've got until the count of 3, he said loud enough now that the entire diner had fallen into a tense, uneasy silence, waiting to see what would happen next. It was then that Darius reached slowly into the inner pocket of his denim jacket, his movement deliberate, unhurried, careful enough that even Grant's hand paused halfway toward his holster. Several customers gasped, certain they were about to witness something far worse than a shouting match. Phones rose higher as the room seemed to hold its breath. What Darius pulled out, however, was nothing more than a plain black cell phone, its screen dark, its surface unremarkable in every way. Nearly everyone in the diner assumed the same thing at once, that he was reaching for a lawyer, perhaps a family member, someone who might rescue him from this humiliation, with a phone call full of desperate pleading. They were wrong. Darius pressed a single button on the side of the phone in a sequence so quick and practiced that it barely registered as unusual to anyone not paying close attention. He raised the device briefly to his ear, and in a voice utterly devoid of panic, spoke 6 words that meant absolutely nothing to anyone in that diner except the person on the other end of the line. "Operation Maple, status compromised," he said as calmly as if he were reporting the weather, then lowered the phone without waiting for a reply. Grant blinked, momentarily thrown by the strange clipped phrase, though he quickly dismissed it as some kind of bluff meant to intimidate him. Celeste, without a word, reached into her cardigan pocket and typed a short sequence into her own phone, her fingers moving with practice speed, sending what appeared to be nothing more than a text message. In reality, it was an authentication code, one that would activate a chain of communication reaching far beyond the walls of this small diner. Neither of them stood. Neither of them attempted to leave. They remained in the booth with their hands folded, waiting with the unnerving patience of people who already knew what was coming. Grant, furious at what he perceived as continued defiance, unclipped a pair of handcuffs from his belt, the metallic click drawing gasps from several onlookers. "That's it?" he snapped, stepping around the table toward Darius. "You're both under arrest for obstruction." Wade, still standing nearby, nodded in approval, apparently ready to back whatever charge his junior officer decided to invent on the spot. Evelyn covered her mouth with both hands, tears welling in her eyes, certain she was about to watch 2 innocent people dragged out in cuffs over nothing but a bad breakfast and worse judgment. A tense silence stretched across the diner as Grant circled the table, the handcuffs dangling loosely from his fingers, his confidence swelling with every step closer. Somewhere near the counter, someone whispered a plea for him to stop, though the voice was too quiet and too frightened to carry any real weight. Celeste sat perfectly still, her eyes locked not on Grant, but on the window behind him, watching the parking lot with the patient focus of someone counting down seconds on an invisible clock. Darius did not move either, his hands resting calmly on the table, his expression betraying nothing but quiet, unshaken patience, as though he already knew exactly how many more seconds this moment had left to run. At that exact moment, Through the diner's front window, several unmarked black sedans rolled quietly into the parking lot, moving with a coordination that no ordinary traffic could explain. Customers near the window turned first, drawn by the sudden convergence of vehicles arriving almost simultaneously, doors opening in near-perfect unison. Grant, cuffs still dangling from one hand, paused mid-step, his confidence flickering for the first time since he had entered the building. Nobody in that diner, including Wade, had any idea what was unfolding outside, though. The growing knot in Grant's stomach suggested that some instinct within him had already sensed his mistake. The diner's front door opened again, but this time no customer or curious neighbor stepped through it. A woman stepped through first, moving with the calm, deliberate authority of someone who commanded rooms for a living. Her badge was already visible on her hip, and her eyes scanned the room with practiced precision. Behind her, 5 more figures entered in plain clothes, their postures unmistakably trained, their presence instantly transforming the atmosphere of the diner from confusion into something closer to reverence. Captain Marissa Quinn walked directly past both Grant and Wade without acknowledging either of them, her focus entirely fixed on the booth in the corner. She stopped in front of Darius, straightened her shoulders, and said a single word that stunned nearly everyone listening. "Sir," she said, her voice crisp, respectful, unmistakably deferential toward the very man Grant had just tried to drag out in handcuffs. Silence swallowed the diner so completely that the refrigerator humming behind the counter suddenly sounded deafening. Celeste reached into her cardigan once more, this time producing a small leather badge wallet, flipping it open with a practiced motion that revealed a gleaming detective shield beneath the fabric. Darius followed, retrieving a folded document from his jacket, an official assignment certificate bearing seals that Grant recognized instantly. They were seals belonging to the very department he served. Marissa turned to address the stunned diner, her voice carrying easily across the silent room without needing to be raised at all. "These 2 individuals," she said, gesturing toward the booth, "are Detectives Darius and Celeste Hale, both currently assigned to an internal affairs and organized crime task force." A ripple of shock passed through the crowd, whispers breaking out despite the tension still thick in the air. Marissa continued, explaining that the couple had spent months embedded in an undercover operation targeting corruption within this very city's police department, an operation that had remained completely confidential until that moment. The color vanished from Grant's face. The handcuffs slipped from his fingers and struck the tile with a useless metallic clatter. Wade, standing frozen beside his junior officer, opened his mouth as if to explain himself, though no words managed to escape. Marissa's gaze shifted toward him, cold and unblinking. It was the kind of look that needed no accompanying threat to communicate exactly how much trouble he now faced. Evelyn, still standing near the counter with tears streaking her cheeks, pressed a trembling hand to her chest, overwhelmed by the sudden and impossible turn the morning had taken. Whispers rippled through the diner as customers turned to one another in disbelief, several lowering their phones now that the scene had shifted from shocking cruelty to something closer to stunned wonder. The 2 teenagers by the counter exchanged a wide-eyed look, one of them mouthing the word detective silently to the other, as if still trying to convince himself it was real. The retired construction worker near the window let out a low whistle under his breath, shaking his head slowly, muttering that he had never seen anything quite like it in all his years living in this town. Even the young line cook, still peering through the serving window, had gone completely still, his spatula forgotten entirely in his hand. Marissa allowed the silence to stretch for a long moment before speaking again, letting the weight of the revelations settle fully over the room. She explained calmly and without theatrics that everything which had just occurred inside this diner had already been recorded not only by the customers' own phones, but by multiple additional sources that neither Grant nor Wade had been aware of. The diner's internal security camera, she noted, had captured the entire confrontation from start to finish. Its footage had already been secured. Beyond that, she revealed that several plainclothes officers who had just entered had been stationed nearby, their body cameras running continuously before Grant ever stepped through the door. Grant's mouth opened and closed several times, no coherent sound emerging, his earlier confidence completely dissolved into stunned disbelief. Darius finally rose from the booth, unhurried, brushing a small crumb from his sleeve before speaking directly to the sergeant, standing frozen beside his subordinate. "This wasn't the first time," Darius said quietly, his tone free of anger, free of triumph, simply stating a fact. He revealed that Officer Sutter's name had appeared repeatedly throughout the ongoing investigation, tied to at least 7 prior incidents involving excessive force, unlawful searches, and repeated interference with cases that should never have been obstructed. Wade's face went pale as Darius continued, explaining that 2 of those obstructed cases had in fact been directly connected to the very corruption network Darius and Celeste had spent months infiltrating. What today's incident revealed, Darius explained, was not an isolated lapse in judgment, but rather the final unnecessary mistake in a long pattern of behavior that had already been under close scrutiny. Marissa added that the investigation into Grant's conduct would now expand immediately, incorporating today's events as fresh, undeniable evidence gathered in full view of dozens of witnesses. Wade's hands trembled slightly at his sides. The reality of his own complicity settled over him with crushing weight. One of the plainclothes detectives who had entered alongside Marissa stepped forward, holding a slim folder that had clearly been prepared well in advance of this very moment. Inside, Marissa explained, were sworn statements from 3 separate citizens who had filed complaints against Grant over the years. Each had previously been closed without any real investigation. Each one had now been reopened. She noted calmly but firmly that Sergeant Carver's signature appeared on every single one of those closed files. The detail made Wade's already pale face turn nearly gray. Grant opened his mouth to protest, to claim some kind of misunderstanding, but the words died in his throat the moment he saw the folder being handed directly to Marissa's assistant for processing. Soon afterward, the corruption investigation that had remained hidden for months expanded into something far larger than anyone inside the diner had imagined. Marissa's team, working alongside city officials, obtained warrants to search the records room at the Central Police Station, along with several computers belonging to officers named throughout the ongoing case files. What they uncovered painted a picture far darker than even Darius and Celeste had initially suspected during their long period of quiet observation. Investigators found altered incident reports, dates, and details quietly changed to protect officers accused of misconduct, some stretching back several years. Digital forensics teams recovered deleted evidence files, including body camera footage that had been wiped from department servers following at least a dozen separate complaints filed by citizens over the years. Several bank accounts traced carefully by financial investigators working alongside Darius's team revealed unexplained deposits totaling well over $200,000 across multiple officers. The funds appeared to originate from a private security contractor with no legitimate connection to the department. The pattern could no longer be dismissed. A small but powerful group inside the department had protected one another while quietly profiting from the very corruption they were sworn to prevent. Investigators also discovered a small notebook hidden inside Wade's desk drawer, filled with handwritten notes detailing which officers had been warned in advance about surprise inspections and which citizen complaints had been quietly buried before ever reaching a supervisor's official desk. One entry dated earlier in the investigation referenced a payment of $15,000 connected to a case involving a warehouse raid that had mysteriously turned up empty despite reliable informant tips beforehand. Darius recognized this case immediately. Having reviewed it himself during the earliest weeks of the undercover operation, never once suspecting it would eventually trace back so directly to the sergeant standing before him now. Piece by piece, investigators exposed a system that had been rotting from within for years, concealed behind badges the community had once trusted without question. News of the search spread quickly through Briar Glen, and before long, Mayor Nolan Pierce had arrived personally at the police station, his expression a mixture of shock and barely contained fury. Nolan, known throughout the city for his careful, measured public persona, stood before a crowd of reporters outside the station. With his voice tight from controlled anger, he announced that an independent oversight committee would be formed immediately, separate entirely from the department's own internal structure, to review every finding uncovered during the investigation. Word of the diner incident, combined with news of the search, spread through the city with startling speed, moving from neighbor to neighbor, from shop to shop, until nearly everyone in Briar Glen had heard some version of the story before the day ended. The days that followed brought a wave of public attention unlike anything Briar Glen had witnessed before. The quiet incident inside Marlowe's diner had grown into something the entire city could not stop discussing. Footage captured by customers who had witnessed the confrontation circulated widely among residents, passing from phone to phone with a speed that stunned even Marissa's experienced team. A formal press conference was held on the City Hall steps, where Mayor Nolan Pierce stood beside Captain Marissa Quinn as they addressed a crowd far larger than anyone had expected for a city as small as this one. Nolan spoke first, his voice steady despite the visible tension in his shoulders, acknowledging publicly that the department had failed the community in ways that demanded immediate and lasting reform. He praised the courage and professionalism of Detectives Darius and Celeste Hale, carefully noting that their composure under such humiliating treatment had ultimately protected the integrity of an investigation that would now hold multiple officers accountable. Marissa followed, outlining the scope of the corruption uncovered, promising transparency throughout the disciplinary process, and confirming that additional officers beyond Grant and Wade were now under active review. After the press conference, customers repeatedly approached Evelyn Marlowe with quiet apologies, some for their own silence that morning, others simply overwhelmed by shame at having witnessed injustice without acting. She accepted each apology gently, though she made clear more than once that the true courage that day had belonged entirely to the couple who had sat calmly through humiliation without ever losing their composure. Several former victims of Officer Sutter's past misconduct, encouraged by the sudden public attention, came forward for the first time, filing formal complaints that added even more weight to the growing case against him. Their stories, long buried out of fear or hopelessness, finally found an audience willing to listen. One young man, a delivery driver named Everett Shaw, described being pulled over repeatedly within a short period for what he was told were routine checks, though both times he had been released without so much as a warning, once Grant realized there was nothing to find. A woman named Laurel Bennett, who ran a small flower shop downtown, recalled an earlier incident when Grant had accused her teenage nephew of shoplifting without any evidence at all. The accusation had never gone anywhere, but had left the boy shaken long afterward. Each new account added another thread to a pattern that oversight investigators now had no choice but to take seriously. The weight of many small, previously ignored injustices had finally converged into something impossible to dismiss. Officer Grant Sutter was formally suspended without pay soon after the incident. His badge and service weapons were surrendered under the watchful eyes of two senior officials from the newly formed Oversight Committee. Sergeant Wade Carver, though not immediately suspended, was placed under formal investigation. His years of quietly protecting junior officers were finally catching up with him in ways he had clearly never anticipated. Throughout it all, Darius and Celeste remained remarkably private, declining nearly every request for interviews, choosing instead to let the evidence and the process speak entirely for itself. Their quiet dignity, so different from the outrage sweeping through the city, only deepened the public's respect for them. A local business owner organized a small gathering outside City Hall, not exactly a protest, but a quiet vigil where residents held handwritten signs thanking the two detectives for their courage without ever naming them directly, respecting the privacy they had so clearly asked for. A retired police captain, long since removed from active duty, wrote a letter to the local newspaper praising the couple's restraint, noting that true strength rarely needed to raise its voice to be heard. Even Nolan Pierce, usually careful never to single out individual officers in public statements, made a brief but pointed remark during a follow-up press briefing, calling Darius and Celeste the kind of quiet professionalism this department desperately needs more of. The city, once divided by fear and silence, seemed slowly to be finding its way towards something resembling unity, built not on outrage alone but on genuine accountability. Some time passed before Briar Glen began to feel something close to normal again. The initial shock waves of the scandal settled into a steadier rhythm of accountability and reform. On a cool, quiet morning, much like the one that had started it all, Darius and Celeste returned to Marlowe's diner, choosing once again the same corner booth beside the window. Evelyn spotted them the moment they walked through the door, and rather than a nervous glance or a cautious greeting, she crossed the room quickly, wrapping Celeste in a warm, grateful embrace before either of them could even sit down. The atmosphere inside the diner felt entirely different this time, free of the weary glances and uneasy silence that had filled the room just before. Regular customers nodded respectfully as the couple settled into their booth, a few offering quiet words of thanks, though none lingered long enough to make the moment uncomfortable. Darius ordered his usual coffee and eggs, toast on the side, and Celeste smiled at the familiarity of it all, grateful that some things at least had remained exactly the same. As they waited for their food, Darius looked out the window at the quiet street beyond, watching the town move slowly through its morning routine, unaware of how close it had come to losing faith entirely in the people meant to protect it. "The most dangerous thing," he said quietly, more to himself than to Celeste, though she was listening closely as always, "isn't power itself. It's power that believes no one will ever be brave enough to question it." Celeste reached across the table, resting her hand gently over his, her expression soft but certain. "And justice," she said, "always begins the moment someone finally decides to stand up." Darius nodded slowly, turning his attention back to his coffee, allowing himself for the first time since the investigation began, a genuine and unguarded smile. Around them, the diner buzzed with ordinary conversation, the comforting clatter of plates and cups, the simple rhythm of a town slowly healing itself one quiet morning at a time. Evelyn stopped by their booth again before the diner grew busy, setting down a small plate of pastries neither of them had ordered, insisting quietly that it was on the house for as long as they kept coming back. Celeste thanked her warmly, and for a moment the two women simply looked at each other, an understanding passing between them that needed no further words. Darius glanced toward the front window and watched a school bus roll slowly past, the children's laughter faintly audible through the glass, a small reminder of the ordinary life this city was slowly reclaiming for itself. He thought briefly of all the mornings just like this one that might have gone differently for other people in other towns, people who never got the chance to be believed, and the thought settled heavily in his chest before passing just as quickly. Celeste noticed the shift in his expression, the way it always seemed to happen when his mind wandered toward the weight of the job rather than the comfort of the moment. She squeezed his hand gently under the table, drawing his attention back to her, back to the warmth of the diner, back to the simple fact that today at least something had gone right. "We did our job," she said softly. "And for once, doing our job meant someone got to keep the position they deserved, while someone else finally lost one they never should have held." Darius managed a quiet laugh at that, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, grateful as always for her ability to find clarity in moments that could easily become heavy. Outside, the golden autumn light spilled gently across Briar Glen streets, warming a city that had learned in the most unexpected way that true justice rarely announces itself loudly. It arrives quietly and patiently, carried by people willing to endure the moment until the truth can no longer remain hidden. Memory pulls back slowly from the corner booth, past the window, past the gravel lot, where an old gray sedan sits parked beside a scattering of ordinary cars, out onto the street where the town continues its quiet morning rhythm. Unaware of how close it had come to losing something far more valuable than a single breakfast, Briar Glen moves forward now, a little wiser, a little more watchful, carrying with it the simple lesson that dignity, patience, and truth will always outlast arrogance in the end.